Hi there and welcome to a second video for ENT210 on the topic of creativity. One of the things you will very swiftly realize is that there are many different components to why we are creative, what motivates us, what demotivates us. And that's one of the reasons why after 150 years of research, we really haven't in many ways got terribly close to the answer of why people are creative at all. Some of the categories that impact this are physiology, the physiology of the brain. We will get into that a little bit later. People sort of imagine that in general people's brains are identical, and for the most part this is true. There is a critical element to the brain in the sense that the two hemispheres of the brain are separated by a really miserable piece of communication equipment called the corpus callosum. And this is really the only way that you can get data from one half of the brain to the other. And sort of technologically speaking, here we are in the era of 5G and fiber optic on broadband. Well, the corpus callosum is more like sort of wet string in comparison to all that. Makes it very difficult for the both halves of the brain to converse. There are exceptions to that. Anyway, that is one little piece of information about creativity, because there is evidence that creativity uses both halves of the brain, and so clearly people that can communicate more readily from one half of the brain to the other might have the upper hand to some extent. Other factors, there are in fact gender-related issues regarding creativity, not in the sense that women are more creative than men necessarily, but that in certain domains women have been found to operate more creatively than men. In the area of writing, for example, women have a tendency to be more creative in their writing than men do. Now, that may not necessarily be strictly a physiological issue, because it might be a learned response due to society's traditional sort of gender roles that we apply. Other issues, though, for instance, intelligence. Now, you might imagine that more intelligent people tend to be more creative. And that's not strictly the case necessarily. It is what we call in social sciences a curvilinear relationship, which sort of starts here and then goes up and then goes down again. So an inverted mixing bowl. In other words, if you have a very low IQ, you're not likely to be very creative. But over and above a certain level, maybe somewhere between 110 and 120, more intelligence, a higher IQ than that does not indicate a higher level of creativity. And that may be a problem with the way that we attempt to measure intelligence. So in other words, there might be a problem with that scale that we apply. So physiological issues may have a certain influence on how creative we are and why we're creative. We have psychological factors. As you will learn, there are things that you might not have expected to perhaps have some relevance. We have a tendency to procrastinate. There are two words here. One is procrastinate, which I think we all know about. If you've got a test due, an essay due in 2 weeks' time, then you might get round to it on day 12. There's another function called precrastinate, and this is where people often tend to be a little perhaps anxious about the notion of handing in tests, exams, and that kind of thing. And so they may actually be, by day 3, they may have had the essay finished and done. Interestingly, those two extremes tend to be less creative, and we'll be talking about that a bit later as well. In other words, the people in the middle tend to be the more creative than the procrastinators or the precrastinators. And we'll find out why that is later in the class. Another psychological factor is whether or not we have a tendency to be in a good mood that we call positive affect, or perhaps a not so good mood, perhaps leaning towards spending our lives being a bit depressed. In other words, in a state of negative affect. Well, positive affect has been found to correlate with creativity. And I want to caution anybody jumping to any conclusions here. We can't judge from that whether creativity itself is being enhanced by people being of good mood, or, for instance, being creative can be quite exciting. So your good mood might come from the creativity. So we don't know which one drives which, but a tendency to positive affect correlates to a tendency to higher creativity. Then we have a tendency towards divergent thinking. And this is really the kind of meat and potatoes of the whole creativity process. Ultimately, when we talk about creativity, we are, in almost any way or domain, we're really talking about doing things in a way that is a little bit different than either we or other people have done before. And to actually turn that into a creative idea generally involves connecting things that are previously unconnected. In other words, when posed with a question, and this could be anything. This doesn't have to be, sort of an organizationally related question. How do we improve profits? This could be, how can I make my painting style more exciting? How can I compose a piece of music that is really genuinely unique and different? So in any sort of area of where creativity is applied, it generally involves what we call divergent thinking. In other words, convergent thinking is where we're focused on a very narrow sort of idea. In other words, we have a problem to solve, and we tend to fixate on one solution to it. Divergent thinking, as you might imagine, is where the brain sort of opens up to allow a lot greater variety, perhaps from different domains, and ideas from lots of different sources, in other words, coming together to contribute to our problem solution. And divergent thinking is intimately linked with creativity. And in terms of doing research, measuring divergent thinking is a lot easier than measuring this very nebulous concept called creativity. So we often have divergent thinking tests that we like to think of as a proxy for measuring creativity. And thirdly, we also have environmental issues that impact creativity. Now, I'm not talking about anything to do with global warming here. I'm talking about things in our environment that might impact how creative we are. One of these might be quite simply where we live or where we are from. Individualist countries, America is sort of number one in the world for individualism, which is where you put the individual is valued to a greater extent than the group, versus collectivist countries, where it is expected that you will put the good of the group above that of the individual. And collectivist countries tend to be from the East, and individualist countries tend to be the US and Northern Europe, the more sophisticated countries in terms of technological development and that kinds of things. And if you cast your mind back to that history lesson at school, where I'm sure you're all sort of wide awake and waiting to learn a little bit about the Industrial Revolution, you will know that most of the technological advances, if not all, came from Great Britain and Northern Europe, and later on in the United States. So, these are all high in individualism. The other factor that in the environment that might impact how creative we're feeling today is the what kind of threats are we under? Tendency to worry about things. If we are in a very stressful situation, we have to get this job done by tomorrow, or the company is going bust and they're expecting us to still perform at the highest level, or all sorts of different things. We have to get buy a house because the lease is running out on this one, but unfortunately that raise I was expecting to get the other day didn't happen. So all these kinds of stressful situations can impact how creative we are. I mentioned just a few seconds ago under psychological factors the difference between divergent thinking and convergent thinking. And one of the things that happens when we're under stress is we tend to focus on one idea. It's called seizing and freezing. We seize on an idea and freeze the search for any other types of idea. And of course, that is not really what creativity is all about. The other thing that we will get to in the environmental issues part of the deal is what if we have a tendency towards group membership. And sometimes this is to do with our upbringing. I spent a lot of time on my own as a small child, and I suspect that's why I don't tend to gravitate towards being in groups. On the other hand, other people I know that have been in groups all their lives, perhaps in a large family or whatever, tend to be much more group oriented than I am. And this, as you will find out later, does have a significant impact on our tendencies to be creative. So you can see that creativity is comprised of many different factors, and it's really it's quite a sensitive attribute in that it doesn't take very much to demotivate you from being creative. And you may have seen this if you've been unfortunate enough to be in a poorly run brainstorming session. You may have witnessed this. You may have seen how people's ideas can peter off very quickly if, for instance, they are quashed. Somebody comes out with a novel idea, and somebody else in the group, if it's a poorly run group, sort of says, yeah, we tried that actually, and it just didn't work. Yes, well, of course that would work if we had the resources, but obviously we don't. Or any other thing, that comes up in terms of brainstorming. Brainstorming does not have to be run in that sort of way, but it often is, because people don't always deem it necessary to have a professional as a facilitator. Anyway, you can see that those kinds of impacts would really have a major challenge in terms of creativity. And I think one of the other things that one needs to throw in here, which is an environmental factor, is something that we're all familiar with, and that is fear of failure. If you come up with 10 exciting ideas, there's a very good chance that 9 of them won't be chosen. I mean, just if you yourself, not in terms of talking to other people, but if you yourself are coming up with a number of ideas as to how to solve this problem, you're only going to choose what you consider, after due consideration, to be the best, right? So the others are not going to be chosen. So in an organizational context, that kind of thing can end up being a demotivating factor. If somebody else's idea is chosen, yours isn't, and that situation isn't handled well, you might be demotivated in terms of thinking up any other ideas. So also, if we do branch out and do something new, which is what being creative is all about, It's about treading a path that other people and ourselves have not trodden before. There you are exposing yourself to the possibility of failure. And so how you treat failure and how that treatment occurs around you will have a significant impact on your tendency to be creative in the future. So those are a few of the things that we're going to be looking at. And I'm going to be starting actually with the last one, the environmental issues, because, and that might seem a strange place to start as far as you're concerned, but in reality, one of the reasons that we make decisions, one of the strongest influences is social norms. And social norms are the unwritten rules that guide the way that we make decisions and the way that we behave. And they are extremely powerful. We like to think of ourselves as being sort of autonomous creatures that are able to make decisions for ourselves. And the reality is very different from that. We generally make decisions that fit into the social norms around us. In other words, making decisions that we feel other people would approve of. And that's a fairly comfortable way to be. If we're not that, if we're making decisions that are outside of the social norms, then we are going to have a struggle in life. So, you know, it's a pretty healthy way to be. But in terms of creativity, we have to find ways of breaking the mold a little bit if we are going to be creative. So those are the kinds of things that we're going to be looking at under the environmental issues, and I hope that makes a bit of sense as to why I am choosing that first. So anyway, let's get on and have fun with the course.